Hi, welcome back to Jaffe Woodwinds. And today our special guest is Jim Snidero, one of the great alto saxophonists for many, many decades now, and one of the more influential jazz educators as well. And Jim is someone I've looked up to and admired. In fact, was fortunate enough for a brief time to have him on the faculty at a school where I used to teach. And so I'm hoping today to make Jim available to all of you out there, and so you can learn more about his history, his music, certainly some of his recordings and books, and learn something about the music in itself. So, Jim, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it. It's been a long time coming, and um, just want to start off as I typically do when I interview most people, getting to learn a little bit about your history, where you grew up, and how you got started in music.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Ed, for having me. We've been, comrades in this business for a long time, and I appreciated all the interaction we've had over the years. All right, so basically, I mean, I was born in California, but my parents moved to the DC area when I was a kid. I mean, a baby actually. So I grew up in outside of Washington D.C., and it was a terrific place to grow up musically because at that time I am fairly old, and at that time there was a draft still in the because there was a Vietnam War was just ending and that kind of thing. So around DC there were so many terrific service musicians, guys in the Airmen of Note, the Army Blues, the Navy Commodores, but all kinds of guys around because if they, it turns out if they enlisted, then they could choose to be a musician. But if they were drafted, then maybe not. So a lot of those guys got in there. And so I had many, many great private teachers. There were concerts all the time. And plus, around DC back then, there were four or five jazz clubs that had, McCoy Tyner, Bill Evans, you name it, all kinds of great people there. So it was a great place to be immersed in jazz and a great place in general for music education. I had the typical story. I had a guy who was my band director in middle school. He had just come in. He had been in the service, then got his teaching degree, came in. He was a jazz alto saxophone player, and I was 13 years old. And that was it. As soon as the very first rehearsal we had for a big band. I was 13 or something. I knew that I was going to be a jazz musician. That was it. It was as clear to me as could be. And I was so into it too. The whole camaraderie with the band kids. And I think there's a special connection with band kids in general that is really enlightening in a way to the way that you work with people and to play music, and just a nice attitude, I think, with music kids. And so we hung out a lot. We used to go to it was probably the biggest at the time, but definitely one of the biggest music stores in the country, Chuck Levin's Washington Music Center in Maryland. And that's where I got my first saxophone. My band director talked my parents into getting a Mark VI when I was 14 years old, and I'll never forget it was $450.
Yeah.
And the band director made the case that, listen, if it doesn't work out, you can sell it and get your money back, which was essentially true. And so my parents went for it, which was a lot of money. They had 5 kids and everything. But I remember going to Chuck Levin's Music Center and going down in the basement, and there was a wall of Mark VIs.
Yeah.
There was like 30 Mark VI altos, brand new in case never been played. And he picked one out for me because he was an alto player and it had an F sharp on it. And that was the horn I played all through college, actually, until 3 or 4 years into New York, I started playing another horn. But I was just deeply immersed in the whole thing is the point. And then I had some private teachers that turned me on to Phil Woods. And typical of guys from my era, Phil was a very strong and influential personality for young guys like me back then.
I think he was an influential personality for old guys too.
Yeah, everybody, but especially because I never got to see Cannonball play, and I didn't know about Stitt until I went to college. But around Washington, when I was a kid, Phil would come through, and he was actually a guest with a summer big band that I played in. I played lead alto summer big band. I started studying with him, and he was the springboard into the next level as far as jazz is concerned. So I had always heard that kind of sound in my head with Phil. I had all the records, um, and I had the same equipment. You know, back then you could walk into a music store and buy a New York Meyer, and
True.
that was $30, something
And you
like
could
that.
and you could also pick out your individual reeds that you wanted.
That's right. That's right. They had the stack with the
Right,
one that's pulled out of the box,
right.
which I did many times. And so I was playing very similar equipment, and to me, it was just something that I was really striving for. And so that was kind of my springboard to deciding that I was going to really make a run at being a professional jazz alto saxophone player. Uh, and I went to North Texas. Then I went to University of North Texas, and I got a record collection called the Smithsonian Institute Collection of Jazz, and it was a collection of albums it was about this thick. There were probably 10 albums in there. It was the whole history
Right.
of the music, and that's basically where I started to learn about other players and hearing it all. I didn't really know about Monk. I didn't know I knew about Coltrane, but I didn't really know about Coltrane's band. I started to get into McCoy, just deeper into the whole details of the era and the bands. And you have to remember that this was in the late 70s. So, I mean, Train had just died about 10, 12 years ago. Before that, I mean.
Right.
And so the music was still everywhere. It was still exciting. It was still very new. Not that it doesn't sound new now or interesting or anything like that, but it was very much still part of the culture and generation. And so I went to North Texas, and that was the best thing I had ever done at that point because back then there weren't that many schools to go to. First off, they're essentially, I mean, world class, well funded, great teachers, all of that. There were a handful of schools,
Right.
Berkeley, North Texas, University of Miami, Eastman,
Yeah.
Indiana. Those are five that I can think of
Yeah.
off the top. But I really wanted to go to North Texas because there were a lot of saxophone players there, and I felt like I needed to be around people that were better than me. When I went to North Texas, there were 125 saxophone players.
Wow.
Yeah. And there were 10 big bands, and I made lead alto in the 10th big band. So I was out of 20 alto players, I was number 18 that made a big band, which was not that bad, I guess. I had a good sound, and had played a lot of classical saxophone. As a matter of fact, my audition piece for North Texas was the Bear, uh, Constantine de Camera.
Right.
And I had taken that very seriously. I'd been in competition, so I had played a lot of classical saxophone. So I was a pretty good technician for my age.
So you were auditioning for a jazz program, but yet they asked you to play a concert piece, a classical.
They didn't ask me to do that. It would just, I thought it was the strongest thing that I could send them.
I see.
Uh, and, I can't remember. I guess I was a jazz ed major. I don't really remember, but I was a really good classical saxophone player. I still have the tape. It sounds good. Uh, and I would, I could play. I wasn't a great improviser when I went to college. I didn't know that much. I was playing from records, copying records and stuff, but I didn't really know what I was doing.
Well, let me ask you this. When you studied with Phil Woods, I mean, you was one of the greatest alto players in the history of the music, greatest alto players, period, and one of the great musicians, certainly in our country. What did you actually study with Phil during that time, prior to going to North Texas?
I had I had maybe two or three lessons before I went to North Texas with Phil. What happened was is I was in a summer big band, as I said, and there's this arranger. His name was Bill Potts,
Oh,
and
sure.
yeah, he was a very good friend of Phil's, and Bill was the director of the program in Maryland. So Bill directed the band, and Phil came down, and he was the guest artist. That's when I met Phil. And one day I was in the lobby, and he says, "Come here with me." And he took me in a room, and he showed me what a 251 was. He did it without me asking anything or saying anything, and I never will never forget that. And I reminded him about that many years later. And so he saw a potential in me. He told my parents I had a great sound. And, then I connected with him. I had to drive from DC up to Phil's place in Delaware Water Gap. And basically, what Phil did was he was explaining theory to me at that point. We didn't really, he never took out his horn. I had to almost beg him to take out his horn. He was always sitting at the piano. And so I started to understand about the nuts and bolts of jazz theory. And that was right before I went to North Texas. So it was a great way to just
I
kind
see.
of work my way into it. But that's kind of why I wanted to send the classical piece in, because I wanted to show that I could play the saxophone and I had chops and stuff.
Right, right.
It worked out fine. And so I went to North Texas, made many, many great friends. A lot of them are movers and shakers as players or as educators. And the big band, I was in the 1 o'clock band for 2 years, and I still have that recording, and it sounds absolutely amazing for a bunch of kids. It really sounds great. And it taught me about quality. It taught me about ensemble playing. Uh, I had to work on my doubles. I started playing flute actually when I was in middle school. I knew that I wanted to do this, and I got with a guy that was a saxophone player that played flute and clarinet too, and I started playing flute. So I was a pretty good flute player, and I've actually recorded on flute. So I started to get into the doubles thing, the soprano, basically what a kid of that era would do to prepare for, you know, uh, hopefully getting a job with Buddy Rich or Maynard Ferguson, or
Right,
going to New York and maybe start doing some rehearsal bands and maybe Broadway, something like that.
right.
I always knew that I wanted to be a jazz soloist, but I was just following the path that everybody else did, knowing that I was going to New York. And so in 1981, I went to New York. I had relatives that lived in the area. I lived with them for a while. Some of my other friends had moved to New York from North Texas. Um, and that's one thing that I think is important for young people to understand about going to distinguished program, a distinguished school, because, you know, as another example, people don't just go to an Ivy League school like Harvard to get a great education. They also go there because they're going to have colleagues that are going to be some of the movers and shakers in the world, and they're going to have those kind of connections and that kind of level of genius and brilliance, whatever you want to call it, rub off on them too. So I found that going to North Texas for me was very good as far as connections in New York were concerned, because within 6 months, someone that had gone to North Texas called me to do something with Jack McDuff because he couldn't make it. And that's how I got the gig with Jack McDuff. It was purely through my connection with someone that went to school, and I was able to
Right,
to do the gig.
right. And
And
yeah,
so that's basically my history up until
yeah,
New
well,
York.
I think you make very good points, especially about the need to be around colleagues, physically around. Whereas today, so many things are done over the internet, and people even go to school over the internet. But from a musical value standpoint, to be around musicians, colleagues in the same room, in the same vicinity, in a live situation, to interact, there's no substitute for that. And
No.
it pains me to see a lot of uh, people taking music degrees online, which to me is self-defeating almost. You can get facts and figures, but music is more than that. And
Of course.
and so that's very interesting. And obviously, there's a little part there that I'm curious about, where you started off as a freshman in the last band, and by your last few years you were in the top band. So that into those few years in between, you must have been practicing and really devoting yourself. Can you talk about, if you can remember exactly how you went about elevating your level to that degree? Obviously, you practice and you have talent, but there's more to it than that. It's the devotion and the sincerity to that goal. If you
Right.
could.
Well, the sincerity to really find the truth in the music. And there's no secret. It's hard work. It's like everybody else that has been able to accomplish something that's worth accomplishing. It's about hard work. But I think that for me, I mean, I've always been a fairly hard worker, but I think for me, the thing that really took me to the next level was inspiration. And when someone asks me, a student or someone asks me if there's one thing, I mean, it's really hard to say that, but one thing I can definitely say is that try to always stay inspired, because that's going to get you through the hard work. That goal, and listening to something and just yelling and going, man, I got to get over to this horn right now because this is just moving me, and I want it so bad. And I think inspiration plays a crucial role in that. And so at school, we had great practice rooms. I was transcribing a lot. We were all transcribing a lot, trying to figure out what's going on. It was really hard to get the records then because a lot of them were out of print. And of course, this was long before the internet or anything like that. So we had lots of bootleg tapes that we make, or we would try to, make greatest hits recordings of Coltrane or something like that. And people would borrow records and try to put a compilation of something together.
Sure.
And it was also, it was a little different then too, because when you did get a hold of, like, a prized Blue Note record that was out of print, you cherished it, and you really were excited about it, and you wanted to hang out with your friends and listen to this thing because it was so special to get it. And so there was that, trying to figure out, how to play, how to improvise, basically. There was the stuff at school that I had to practice as far as parts are concerned, and we had to play classical saxophone for 2 years. We took lessons in that, but come to find out when I got there that the Aber was a master's degree, part of the master's degree curriculum. And I was a freshman, so they didn't really bust my balls on that too much. I had already kind of covered it. And I never played classical mouthpiece. I always played jazz on my Meyer, but I would pick a certain reed or whatever, and I could emulate that sound to a certain degree. And I never believed in playing a classical saxophone setup, and they never bothered me with that.
All right, let me just interject. Although I somewhat disagree with you in that, but there's an interesting story, because playing classical saxophone on a Meyer. Do you know that Jimmy Abato played his entire career on a Meyer, and he played all of those classical pieces on a Meyer? Now, it was a relatively closed New York Meyer. I believe it was a 3 or a 4, something of that nature.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
but but the point is, if you have the concept in your ears and the mouthpiece isn't too far gone, I mean,
right.
I mean, in extreme, uh, it can be done. Look, I use Ted Nash as a good example today. We were playing in a sax quartet, and he's still playing his Beechler, I think 8 or 9. Excuse me, wide open Beechler, and we were playing some classical stuff, some French stuff. He sounded just perfectly fine, because the music is in his ears and his head and his body, so he bypasses whatever the mouthpiece was originally intended for. Beechler 8 or 9 is not what you would see a classical saxophone player playing. On the other hand, some players like Joe Henderson always played a Selmer soloist. I think it was a C star D, something relatively close. The Kenny Garrett plays a summer soloist, which people think generally is more of a classical saxophone mouthpiece. So the branding of mouthpieces, or even of reeds today, a classical reed, a jazz select reed, it's it's what you hear and what you make of it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the equipment thing is something that I've spent a lot of time with. I think it's super important. And there are characteristics to a mouthpiece that are definitely going to influence the color of the sound and everything. And I'm not advocating necessarily that someone who's playing classical saxophone should or could play. They could, but I'm not saying that they should play
Right.
a jazz mouthpiece because I think that in general I wouldn't really want to hear a jazz saxophone player playing a classical mouthpiece, other than the exception of Kenny and Joe, which are very old. They were very old, good, high quality summer mouthpieces.
Yes.
And there are different things that people do. They put baffles in there, wedges in there, and
Bridges.
stuff
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But to me, the most important thing is to have equipment that is clear and resonant and responsive. This is what I really want out of my sound. That's the pretty much the can of worms right there.
Absolutely.
Getting that for me, I've always had that quality to one degree or another, but getting to the point that I'm at now where I feel like I have my ideal setup, it was a work in progress and it's not that easy anymore. And I do think that people, either by ignorance or just lack of knowledge, or not really caring, accept equipment that is really going to hinder them. They're never going to get to a place uh, that some of the greatest saxophone players have gotten to, because without question, Charlie Parker, Cannonball Adderley, Sonny Stitt, John Coltrane, they all had excellent, excellent equipment. And the more that I found excellent equipment, I realized that how important that was to what they were doing as well.
Sure. Basically, I think I'm trying to remember. It may have been Eddie Daniels who's told me this or said this, that when you have great equipment, you can forget about the equipment. Then you can concentrate on the music, and that's the whole goal
That's
of
true.
equipment. So you don't have to worry about that, and
That's true.
and,
Absolutely.
and it's a great thing. Um, as you were evolving as a jazz artist, and even now, let's talk about some of your musical influences. Obviously, you listed Phil as an early influence. Um, I guess let me backtrack a little bit. Was alto the only saxophone you really wanted to play as your primary voice once you started with it? Did you ever have any desires to move to tenor? Which, a lot of, for instance, Cannonball played tenor before he played altos. Train played alto before he played tenor. So people go back and forth. Did you ever have that desire to go to another saxophone as your primary voice? Did that ever enter your picture?
No, it didn't. It really didn't. I felt like there's a certain quality to the alto that I loved so much that I could never get it on tenor. The kind of soaring quality, uh, in the upper octave, let's say. And I just always loved the voice of the alto. And in a sense, I was a little afraid of the tenor too, because so many people I've known that played alto started fooling around with the tenor and they just kind of fell in love with it. And on the other hand, too, I was talking to Charles McPherson once about this, and I saw him, and he told me, "Man, I've been playing that tenor a little bit, and I'm just always wondering why I'm banging my head against the wall trying to play the alto." But he never switched. So, I like to joke with my tenor friends that they're playing the easy horn. Of course, it's not as simple as that, but I just always love the power and the clarity and the soaring quality of the alto. It really gives a lot. And it's just always been my voice. And I played soprano for some time. And then I just decided I stopped doubling, period, 20 years ago, just because I just decided that, man, I don't want to die holding the flute doing long tones one day to keep my chops together. It just wasn't in my heart, in other words. And I felt like, I've been playing so long and this is what I want to do, and I just have to commit. That's all. So that's what I
Well,
do.
and you let's be honest, you've been very successful. I mean, uh, in my generation, I think you're absolutely one of the most recorded and successful leaders as an alto saxophonist. You have 27 albums to date as a leader, which is formidable. I mean, that's really quite an accomplishment, Jim. And straight ahead stuff, with great sidemen, wonderful compositions. I mean, that's not something to sneer at. That's a major accomplishment. So
Thank you.
you've succeeded in that, and certainly the doubling thing I know, I mean, is all encompassing. And I think now looking back, yeah, if one is going to be absorbed in doubling, there's really not much chance to become a soloist in any other style of music. If you're really going to go full force as a doubler, there's only a certain amount of hours in a day. And regarding your comment about long tones of the flute, Stanley Drucker said, "Life is too short to play long tones." So I
That's a
get it.
good one. I like that.
Yeah. Um, let's now to the question I was sort of insinuating earlier. Uh, the influences, other alto players who influenced you. And let me toss out some names, if you don't mind. Let's start with Bird, Charlie Parker. What was his effect on you, and as you look back, his influence on your playing?
All consuming. There's no one that's ever played the saxophone better than Charlie Parker, jazz or otherwise. And when I was in, I'll just back up just a little bit more. When I was in college, we were very focused on Coltrane's group in the 60s and Miles's group in the 60s. We were really fascinated by the abstraction and the classical influences in there, especially with Miles's band. And that's the way that I wanted to play when I was in college. If you listen to the records I'm on with a college band, Train, Liebman, Wayne Shorter, uh, Steve Grossman, these guys, Joe Henderson, they were all very, very important to me. But then I came to New York. As I mentioned, I got the gig with Brother Jack McDuff, and all of a sudden, none of that applied. I was on this gig, and we were playing Harlem, and the gig would be from 10 till 4 in the morning. And over the course of the evening, we'd probably do 10 blues. And there was very little modal music that was played during the evening. Lots of down home, lots of bebop. And I realized that I was I had some gaps. I realized that if I wanted to be a professional jazz soloist and work with these high level jazz bands, I had to play the crap out of bebop. I just knew it. And I didn't know enough about it. So, and I was hanging out with some other friends that were really into, Blakey and Horace, a great trumpet player, Brian Lynch, and I had recorded a lot in the 80s. And so I just gravitated right to Bird. That was the source. That there was no question at that point. This is what I needed to listen to. And so I would say for most of the 80s, I was consumed with Charlie Parker. I spent so much time, uh, I spent at least 2 or 3 years only listening to Charlie Parker in any serious way and transcribing a lot, just trying to understand how he's playing the saxophone like that. Um, the articulation, the way that he would use alternate fingerings. It was amazing to me that I didn't realize the potential with these fingerings and how he was able to do what he was doing, partially because of where he's using this or that. For example, side C. Bird uses side C all the time,
Yeah.
all the time. And I was not really at that time,
And
especially the
and
high
palm key D.
palm key D, and also one and one B flat. There's all kinds of tricks. I wouldn't say they're tricks, they're techniques, but especially side C, using that to really get the alto sound up there. I use it a lot on high C, and
Huh.
it's much better than the normal C. And every chance Charlie Parker got, he would use side C. On the other hand, Cannonball didn't, but I don't think he really needed it because he was a little bit more of a quiet player, and it was just a little more uh, fuzzy in a way. Bird was, Cats told me when you heard Charlie Parker, you hear him down the street.
That's what I heard as well. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, and that side C, boy, you got the right setup, man. That thing, you're going to hear it from 42nd Street down to 14th Street.
Yes.
It's really just
Yeah.
a monster.
Well, Bert, I know I've spoken about this, and I know you have as well with Charles McPherson quite a bit. And Bird, for Charles's generation, certainly all-consuming. But I don't know if you've noticed this. It may be my just where I've been and who I've been around, but I notice among younger players today, Bird is not discussed or thought about or listened to with that kind of reverence and as frequently. Now, I could be wrong, but have you noticed that at all? Has that occurred to you?
Well, I had a teaching career for a while, just doing some private lessons and things like that. And one class at the new school, I was down there once a week. And that started in 97. And that was until a few years ago. And I saw big changes. And so I was around a lot of good saxophone players from all over the world, actually. And I found when I was first there in the 2000s that they were real focused on who was hot at the time. Josh Redman, Chris Potter, Joe Lovano, Kenny Garrett, guys like that, all fantastic players. I began to see a shift about 10 years ago. Now, maybe that's because there weren't as many hot young guys at that time that were just coming out, or maybe they just decided that through teachers or whatever that they were going to go back. So they were all talking about Charlie Parker, not all, but a lot of them, Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, and they were trying to play like that. So I did
Interesting.
see a shift over the
Huh.
last 10 years to that. I don't know how much it's out there.
Right.
Um, but certainly like Bird, Train, Sonny Rollins, those guys, younger players. So for me, as I just going back to my whole thing, I spent that time with Charlie Parker, and that kind of solidified my playing as an alto player, really, and within the bebop language. And my friends were all very knowledgeable too here in the city. And so I was checking out a lot of Blue Note records after that. But really, the three after Phil, when I went to college, Phil's influence, Phil's influence as a player kind of seeped away. And I started going more towards, as I said, really tenor players, listening to tenor players, a lot of that. Then when I got to New York, and since then, it's really, as far as straight ahead alto player, it's the big three for me: Bird, Cannonball, and Stitt. Those are the three guys that I've spent the most time with as far as trying to understand the alto saxophone and understand that language.
Right.
And I think I understand them pretty well. I spent a lot of time with Cannonball, obviously. I did a tribute record to Cannonball a few years ago with Jeremy Pelt. Sonny Stitt was someone that meant a lot to me as to how he played the alto.
Perfect.
Um,
Yeah,
it
just
was just so magical how he played the alto saxophone too. And also the thing about Stitt was that he also played a Mark VI for most of his career. He either played a balanced or Mark VI, but he played a Selmer.
yes.
Bird and Cannonball didn't play a Selmer.
Right.
They played the King. So right in there, it's going to be hard for you to try to quite get that.
Right.
But with Stitt, pretty close to what I'm playing. And it showed me, Stitt really showed me what was possible on a Mark VI. I would have to say that actually. Um, and so those are kind of the bedrock of who I am as an alto player.
Uh, did Benny Carter or Johnny Hodges play any influence in your playing? Uh,
No, because I I never came from that. Like I got into that after I guess I guess it was really Wynton's influence on the jazz world that made me kind of go back. I have to say that because
right,
I wasn't really that interested in Duke Ellington and Count Basie and that kind of playing, when I was growing up. And then I went back and listened to the music and I just thought I missed so much. Now I understand where the guys that I love are coming from in a certain sense.
right.
Obviously with Benny Carter and Cannonball and the ballad playing of everybody too with Johnny Hodges. But by the time I got into it, my path was kind of set
Right, right.
in
What? Yeah.
a certain I think that really who I am in a way, I think I have my own personality as a player to a certain degree. And I think really who the two main streams for me are those three alto players and then the tenor players of their, well, and I should say as an improviser, though, also plenty of piano players and trumpet players as well. But um, yeah, that's basically where I'm coming from.
Okay, let's jump just to a little more maybe tangible thing for the listeners in regard to how do you go about your practice session? We had talked before we began the interview today about the fact you go down every morning to a basement practice room and practice without any distractions. How do you go about those practice sessions? Is there any type of format that you follow, or is it just as it happens on a particular day, what you feel like doing on a particular morning or what you're inspired to do that day?
No, I'm more organized about it in the sense that I'm generally practicing for projects. Like I'm going to do a record in about 6 or 7 weeks dedicated to Charlie Parker with the same trio that I did my last record with Peter Washington and Joe Farnsworth. And so I've been practicing standards that I'm going to play on the record and just tried to come up with different concepts on those tunes. I spent almost all of my time practicing tunes.
Okay.
It's somehow relating to a tune. Like I might be practicing certain patterns, or I practice a lot of ways of connecting different ideas. The balance, I think a lot about balance of texture and range and energy versus tranquility, that kind of stuff. I actually practice that.
Do you do it? Do you practice at the piano initially before in learning a tune? Do you go to the piano first? Is that part of your regiment?
Yeah, Yeah, I play definitely sit down and play the tune on the piano. If I've never heard the tune, that's the very first thing that I've done. But usually, actually, I should say, usually when I start practicing, I sit at the piano for about 5 minutes and play chords, just so that I open my ears up and I try to hear every note in the chord. So I might play a certain chord progression or a certain tune, play it slowly, and see if I can hear everything, all three, four, or five notes at one time, and every voice leading and all of that stuff. That kind of gets me in the right zone as far as hearing. And I have, I mean, yeah, here's this is a this is a bag that I carry down to the practice room. And in here would be all these notebooks.
Right.
This is from a while ago, and this is from
Yeah.
this is probably from started a couple of years ago. This is the one that I'm working on currently that says 812, and these are some ideas that I've written down. 811, 8-9. I put the dates down. This would be working on Segment, tuned by Charlie Parker.
Sure.
Um, and I have lots and lots of notebooks like that. Um, so as I get older, it's a little harder to remember everything that I'm practicing. So I've gotten very frustrated. I'm sure that I'm going to remember what I practiced, and then the next day I sit down at the practice room and it's one blank slate and I can't remember.
Right. Right.
So
You're
I
not,
try
Jim,
not to.
Jim, just to interject, you're not alone.
Oh, thank you for that vote of confidence. Uh, but I try not to look at the notebooks too much. Like what I basically do is I go down and I try to practice what I was working on the day before, the last few days or whatever, and I try not to look at and if I can't remember, then I briefly look at it
Uh-huh.
and then try to reinforce that in my ear, basically, so that I can, because it's like I used to tell students, you can't play what you can't remember. Like if you sit up there and you've got and I'm very much vocabulary oriented as far as the foundation of improvisation. And that's always for me a springboard for improvisation. I try to be as creative as possible, and I play things that I've never played, and I'm always trying to listen and be musical. But the foundation of what you're doing is vocabulary. And Chick Corea talked about this in his terrific articles in Keyboard Player magazine in the 1970s about how important vocabulary is. Charlie Parker, Lee Conant's told me when I was hanging out with him, he said he had something like 146 licks. This is a simplification and a little bit of BS,
Right.
but you know, uh, I can I know almost all of Charlie Parker's licks one way or another. He's always surprising you, and he's always putting things together, and there's things that he's never played before. But those ideas are the foundation of who he is as an improviser. So for me, like I just want to have those ideas as if I get ready to improvise and the hard drive just opens up and I can access anything easily. And that gives me the freedom not to have to access anything if I don't want, because I can relax and I feel like, and if I'm at my best moment, I don't get caught in a corner. Like I'm not at a loss
Right.
really, because I feel like, I thought a lot about how I react and what makes me feel good as an improviser. And I feel like a lot of it has to do with the things I talked about, the range and density and rests. And, um, I just want to have options for any of these feelings when I'm improvising. If I feel like I suddenly want to play something high, I want to have a lot of things that I can play up in the upper register of the saxophone, not just two or three, lots of ways to move around, lots of ways to combine. And, I tend to be a little bit more systematic about it, at least in my practice, because I just don't have the number of gigs. I feel like the guys from back in the day, they were working so much. You look at Miles Davis's schedule from 1958, 1959, they'd go to Chicago for 2 months, then they'd go to Pittsburgh for 2 months, 7 nights a week, a matinee, whatever it was. So it was so prominent in their heads that it was not easy to remember, but a lot easier than if you're doing, 4 or 5 gigs a month or 6 or 7 gigs a month. It's so for me personally, I have to be a little bit more methodical and systematic about my language and keeping that sharp, or I just can't remember stuff and then I feel like that makes me uptight, that I can't really flow. Somehow it's hurting my flow because I can't find enough ways to make something sound musical and beautiful.
Right.
And that's basically how I practice.
Yeah, no, that I think that's helpful, and I think that's something that we all need to hear. And like I said, I certainly I do that with all my instruments now because I need to. Part of it also is the inspiration of having read the Michael Brecker biography, and then seeing the book that has come out with all of his notebooks, and realizing it's not a bad thing. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's really something that is a great teaching aid for yourself.
Right.
And I went back to all the books that I used to keep when I would study with various teachers and realized how much I'd forgotten or just slipped my mind. So it's a very good thing to be in the act of physically writing. I know this goes against the last 40 years or 35 years where everything is on a tablet and you're putting it on a iPad or a cell phone. But I think the act of physically taking a pencil and putting down on paper in your own handwriting, your own unique handwriting and way of describing the thought somehow lasts longer, transcends more. And I think as you get older, when you look back, you realize that. I don't know. I could be just showing my age.
No, 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 no. I mean, I think it's possible. It it's possible to use a tablet or something and maybe get the same. It's just a matter of comfort zone. I mean, I've been writing music since I was 10 years old. So, it's something that, and as a matter of fact, there's a lot of young people that really would have a hard time like writing out an arrangement properly.
Oh yeah.
Well, and that's fine though. If you're using Sibelius and that's the way you do it, then that's the way you do it. And that's the way I do it now. I mean, I don't write out, a 4-part harmony piece to something on paper anymore. I write it in Sibelius because I can change it so easily, you know. But anyway, so that's pretty much where I'm at as far as practicing is concerned.
All right. Before we get into talking about your work at Jazz Education and some of your publications, I just wanted to delve a little bit more into your equipment, the specific, horns, mouthpieces, ligatures, reeds, neck strap, the whole bit, because I think, a lot of people are interested in that, and it can be quite informative and helpful at times. So what
So
horns do you currently play or have played and still own?
yeah, so I made a big change about a year a year ago. Um, I had been playing a 76,000 Mark VI, which had an F sharp on it, from 1990 until last year, the same horn. And I loved that horn. If you've heard any record of mine, except for the last one, then that's the horn. And when I bought it, it was brand new. It was a piano player that owned it. It was made in 1958. I bought it in 1990, but it had basically never been played. It still had the original pads on it, the original boosters, and all of that. And it was a great horn. It is a great horn. But I started so I was doing a couple records ago. I was doing a project with Kurt Rosenwinkel, who's the greatest jazz guitar player. I mean, just incredible. And I really wanted to make sure that my equipment was optimum because he's not fooling around, and I really wanted to make sure that I was on top of my game. So the neck on my old Mark VI was loose, and I had been using tape on it, metal tape, and it was not working. So I got someone to adjust that neck, and it made a huge difference. And then I had another neck and I had that adjusted, and that made a huge difference too. I could really feel it. I felt like I was more centered and I could play more in tune. So this took me down like a kind of a, this was 2 years ago. It took me down a new path with my equipment. And I had an opportunity to pick up an Alto when I was in Chicago a year ago at PM Woodwinds, which I think is a great woodwind shop, Paul Maslin, who was Brecker's repairman, actually. And there was this Alto there, and it's 104,000, and it had an F sharp on it too. It was in mint condition. But for those of you that are into Mark sixes, you'll know about the different lengths of the bows. So the Mark six that I had before, the 76,000, had a medium bow on it, which most people find to be the most desirable. At least that's the one that goes for most, those saxophones with the medium bow. And they were fooling around with those bows because of the intonation with the low notes. So I, this horn that I got, the new one had the long bow. And um, man, this horn just played so incredibly good. First off, the Altissimo came out much easier.
Huh.
And I come to find out that there are plenty of saxophone players think that the long bow with a Mark 6, the Altissimo comes out a little better. It does on this horn than my other horn. And it just took me, it changed my life really to start playing the saxophone. I couldn't stop playing it. I felt like I was able to play more in tune. My sound was centered, and that I could get certain intervals out more easily. So now I'm playing 104 Mark 6. It's a beautiful saxophone. It has brass resonators on it. It doesn't have the original resonators, but it's fine. I can't tell the difference. I play and I've been playing this mouthpiece for some time now. I guess maybe I've been playing this mouthpiece for about 4 or 5 years. It's a New York Meyer 5. It's from the 60s. And it's a real
Is it a New York, USA?
New
Or
York, USA, excuse me,
okay.
New York, USA. I think it's called the Model 4 if you look at the history of Meyer mouthpieces. Meyer started making it in 1960, and Meyer was sold in 70. So that period between 60 and 70, and that's when Phil got his Meyer mouthpiece. He got it from Oliver Nelson, the one that he played at the rest of his career. That was in 1960 or 61. That was the new model, the Model 4. That's what I play. And it's a real 5. It's 0.070. So it's a close 5.
Close. That is close. Yeah.
Yeah, a close 5. I play Roberto 3M
And it's a
jazz.
medium chamber.
It's a medium chamber.
Medium chamber. Okay.
Yeah. And I play Roberto 3M reeds, and I play old LeBlanc ligatures because I like those ligatures that are made out of that nickel silver. Some people call them German silver. They're the old Martins were made out of the same stuff.
Yes.
The old
Yes.
LeBlancs were made out of the same stuff. It all comes from France. They came from France. And I find that material gives me more clarity. And as I said, that's so important to me. Um, and that's it. But listen, I have to tell you that, I mean, we all know that not all mouthpieces are created equal, and I don't find my mouthpiece to be stuffy in any way, shape, or form. And listen, I played Phil Woods' mouthpiece, and if you heard Phil Woods, he could play louder than shit, and and that mouthpiece was close too. It's the
Yeah.
way that the thing is put together
Yes.
inside. So don't confuse the tip opening with the fullness
Right.
or the volume.
Of course, and I also had the opportunity once to play Phil's mouthpiece, which I felt like it was a jet. It was like just took the sound. It was fantastic. But and of course he had a great airstream and knew how to use his air great in a beautiful way. But the truth is there are a million factors that go into a mouthpiece besides the tip opening and the facing and the length and the what are the dimensions and are they balanced from side to side? Is there a dip? How is the baffle interchanging with the chamber? I mean, there's a million factors, and so just buying a mouthpiece by numbers alone It's ridiculous. You have to try it and see it, like what touched you and what turned you on immediately when you played it. Uh, that's the only
Yeah.
way. And the sad part is that we used to have stores. You grew up in the D.C. area. I grew up in New York, and we had a place here called Charlie Ponte's. And I would go there,
Yeah.
and they had, I mean, you could try mouthpieces all day long there, and as well as pick out reeds and horns, just like what you described, seeing all these 20, 30 Mark Sixes. It was like going into a candy store for a kid. Uh, but you don't have that opportunity today. And also the cost of horns and mouthpieces today has gone, in many cases, through the roof. And it's not so easy for younger players to not only try mouthpieces, but to even afford some of the mouthpieces they'd like to buy. Uh,
Yeah.
there's a great deal of change, but it is interesting to hear about your equipment and the fact that even after all these years, you found something a little better. And that's always a thing to keep in mind. Like if you have good equipment, be happy with it. And if something comes along that's better, great. But to go,
Yeah.
I certainly am guilty going through life constantly looking for the best equipment. It's somewhat of a waste of time if you have good equipment to begin with. Uh,
I agree. I'm not at all an equipment junkie. I've known guys like that, that they're always fooling around with mouthpieces, and some guys are working on their own mouthpieces and they turn them into a doorstop, basically.
yeah,
So, I
yeah.
mean, I actually never even wanted to get the measuring tools for my facing, because I knew I'd be too tempted to try to
Yes.
start working on a mouthpiece. And this is one place that I didn't want to go. A, I know a really good mouthpiece technician, in my opinion, the best. Uh, and so if I need something done, he's the guy that I'm going to go to get it done. As a matter of fact, just as a sidebar, um, recently I, I've had another mouthpiece. I have a bunch of Myers, but there's one that is pretty close to mine. Wasn't as good, but it was pretty close, at least visually, and it played pretty good. So what I did was I went down to Georgia, to Marietta, Georgia, to a company that is a measuring company, and they had these giant CAT scan machines that are used for industrial purposes. But these guys also worked for the Defense Department and all. It was the real deal. And what I had done was I had a CAT scan done of my mouthpiece and of the my number two mouthpieces. And what they were able to do was superimpose the two and show
Where the differences are.
exactly where the differences were. Then once I understood that, I went to my guy, and it's as close as you possibly can get now. So this is one case where technology has really helped to kind of dial in equipment.
No question. And I know we're both golf junkies. And the golf people have done this way before. They were on top of this where they would mirror someone's swing, let's say an amateur swing like ours, against a professional swing, and they could see where the differences are. But mostly because you put on a flak jacket, they could figure out what muscles were being used in what way, what muscles were not firing, so that you could develop exercises to improve your performance.
Wow.
And it's the
Wow.
same,
Yeah.
but it's the same concept. And of course, even when you get the measurements exact, there's always some little difference. But the point is, you can get something really close.
Really cool. Yeah.
And just one little question, because I never asked you this, but I had heard that you had or bought at one time Cannonball's Meyer mouthpiece. Is that true?
I have Cannonball's mouthpiece. I have the mouthpiece that he used on Kind of Blue.
Oh, okay.
And if you want to know the story, uh, when Cannonball died, he gave Cannonball's wife, Olga, she was a actress. Cannonball lived in LA at that time when he died. And Cannonball's wife gave Bill Green, who was an African American studio player in
Yes,
LA,
LA.
and
Yeah.
Cannonball's best friend, or one of his best friends. Olga gave Bill Cannonball's equipment. And a friend of mine, or someone that I became friends with later, was best friends with Bill. His name was Dave Edwards. Dave Edwards was the lead alto player on the Lawrence Welk band on
He was
TV.
a wonderful player. Yeah,
Great alto.
great. Yeah.
So Bill and Dave were best friends. They both lived in LA. Bill gave Dave Cannonball's mouthpiece. And then Dave and I became friends. And when he died, Dave's wife gave me the mouthpiece. And I give a little tribute to on my strings record. I haven't used it on any recordings, but that's about when I got it, was about 2000, something like that. So I've had it for about 24 years. And the reason it's of course unique because you could never be sure if it just was a Meyer mouthpiece and it looked like a Meyer mouthpiece. You could never be sure really that it was the actual mouthpiece. But there's a unique thing about this, and that is that Cannonball cracked the mouthpiece on the shank,
Huh.
right on the end, probably because he shoved it on there
Too
because
far.
the cork was too thick.
So is there a ring around it, a metal ring to hold
There's
it?
a ring on it, and the ring has custom engraved bands on it, two little bands on it. And you can see that on recordings. You
Huh.
can see that exact band on it exactly. So it's the mouthpiece for sure.
Yeah.
And it's the best.
Yeah.
It's not what I want. The chamber is a little bit bigger. I think feel like I can be more myself on the mouthpiece style that I like. And actually, Cannonball did change to the one that Phil played, that style that Phil played than I play.
Well, didn't Cannibal also play a Gregory at various times, I thought?
No, that's a misnomer. People
Okay.
would say that because they saw the band on
Oh, I
the
see. I see.
he never those mouthpieces sound nothing like. No, he never played a Gregory. He you can see in about 1955 he's playing the Meyer Brothers mouthpiece. There's no ring on it. And then sometime between 55 when he got to New York and about 57 he cracked it and he got the ring put on there. And that's what he played until about 65. He drilled a hole in it and put the
Pickup?
microphone on there,
Yeah, yeah,
the whatever they called that thing back then.
yeah.
Uh, and then the hole was filled in. But then he switched to the newer style New York, USA mouthpiece, because you can see that on, I think, Mercy, Mercy, Mercy on the cover. He's playing one of those mouthpieces, and you can see him on videos too. So the facing was off. Definitely the facing was off, and that's probably why he stopped playing it, because he didn't seem to really want to deal with it. And it also the Series 4 Myers from 60 to 70, they have more punch. They project more. And I think Cannonball became a louder alto player with that mouthpiece too. The one that I have that is from it's beautifully warm and covered, but it's not one of those mouthpieces that you would play and just like shoot across the room.
Right, right. No, I understand. That's interesting. Thanks for sharing that. I've always wondered, and I've never had a chance to ask you about it. Let's talk about some of your publications. Years ago, I remember when the Jazz Conception series came out that you authored, and had three different levels, which was very helpful for those of us in jazz education at the school, so we could, depending on the student's level, could get them going. And you also have one of the nice things about all your publications done, I think, by Advanced Music, beautifully laid out, just really artistically done, and no mistakes. I mean, that's one thing Advanced Music makes sure if everything is really sort of perfect. And but you've always laid out your books for all the instruments, so that if one was playing an E flat instrument, you had that. If you B flat instrument, a C instrument, and specific sometimes to, let's say if it's a C instrument, yes, you're going to have a C flute or a violin or the E flat alto or the B flat tenor or the B flat clarinet, and you'd have them set with that. And oftentimes it would have, certainly in the early series, you had wonderful players on those instruments demonstrating what you had written, including yourself. Now, in recent years, you have The Essence of the Blues publication from about 8 years ago, and more recently, The Essence of Bebop. So, and we're going to show all these books on the video as we speak. But let's talk about The Essence of Bebop, since that's the latest publication also something you referenced to how much you needed to get into it when you came to New York and how much you have done over the last 35 years as a bebop jazz alto player. So talk about the publication a little bit.
Well, I felt like with my other books, there wasn't, I didn't really go into a lot of explanations about why this worked on this tune or what this lick really was about, or why this idea connected to this idea nicely, or, like the more macro feeling of a solo. I didn't talk about any of that. And I felt like with the essence of bebop that I wanted to first off concentrate, which is different from the other books, is I wanted to concentrate on one player on each etude. And I wanted to explain a certain few concepts that were typical of that player and how the overarching language kind of connected together and where it's coming from and how it fit into the puzzle. And so I did a lot of research and I wrote these pieces to somehow highlight the styles of different players within the bebop and hard bop era, and then go about explaining how just as I said before, how ideas progress. There's plenty of theory in there, but I wanted the theory to always relate to a solo that really, the theory was just a piece of the puzzle that you had to really see how it worked its way into this particular part of the solo, where it's going, and how it became an effective story, so to speak. So, for example, in the one I did for Miles, it's based on all of you. And Miles recorded that in '63, I think it was. He recorded several times, but he did his with the live Europe band in '63 with George Coleman. And I talk a lot about in that piece. It's very the arrangement's just about the same. Where they at the end of the solo they cycle into 3-6-2-5 turnaround section and cue it out. And I talk a lot about the way that, especially George Coleman, the way that the solo progresses from starting off kind of simple and sparse, then starting to use more density and harmony, where you're starting to bring more color out on different chords and spicing things up a little bit, and started increasing the intensity by playing more double time, and then building this kind of crescendo of excitement with these different techniques, which they did every night. If you listen to other records, it's basically the same kind of arc. Uh, and then after all of that kind of density of double time and harmony, going to the blues and riffing at the end to take it out. So there's this beautiful balance between density and sparseness, between color and more abstracted kind of classical colors to the blues, in the way that this whole thing turns out to be this beautiful story from beginning to end. And honestly, it's not something that I mean, I've thought about it on and off over the years and spent time, but I really didn't quite get to the nitty gritty of what it was really about in the case of this band, for example, on that tune. And it was really interesting to me to see how calculated it was. Like that, they knew where they were going to go. They didn't know quite how they were going to get there, but they knew they were going to get here, and they knew that they were going to use this here. And you can hear the band anticipating what guys do. And it's funny. Chris Potter has said many times that Red Rodney used to do the same thing when he was working with him. That Red would get to the same place on a solo that he did the night before, but how he got there was maybe a little bit different, a little bit longer, a little bit more dense, a little bit more. So that's really the kind of the musical calculation that really makes a story effective. That it's not just meandering, not that it has to be meandering. I mean, not that sometimes might be called for in a way, not meandering, but kind of, kind of sometimes Miles, for example, would keep a straight line with the intensity. He'd start up here and he'd stay there the whole time. That was one of the things that he did. But in general, I wanted to explore that. So I got into that with a bunch of different players, Freddie Hubbard, Miles, Bird, of course, on rhythm changes that I think are really very, very interesting in switch keys. Um, and Monk, Horace Silver, Cannonball, a few others. There are 10.
And like all of your other books, they are written for all the various transpositions of
But
instruments.
not all, not quite as many. We did it um, for B flat, E flat, and C. No, that covers. We didn't do bass. Oh, no, no, no. We did do trombone too, but we didn't get into like let's see. What did I do? Oh, yeah, we had bass trombone on one, we had violin on one, all that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I guess it does cover everything. It's like 6 books, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And
And
I hope you'll check out the play-alongs because listening to Grant Stewart on the tenor on this thing is just incredible. Mike Deese on trombone, for me, the world's greatest trombone player right now. To be able to pull this stuff off and sound that good, and
yeah,
so
well, you've done that on
it's
all of I'm sorry, you've done that on all of your publications. Have other great players come in and demonstrate on these other instruments, and
yeah,
that's such a valuable thing for younger players and for more experienced players. Just hearing how it might be interpreted and the
right.
different voices doing it, it's wonderful and really first-rate publications
I
always.
appreciate that. That'll probably be my last book, The Essence of Bebop. It's the book I'm most proud of. I think it's my best book. I feel like if someone starts at the beginning with that book and they have reasonable abilities on the instrument, nothing special, just average abilities on the instrument, and they have average IQ and average drive and everything else. If they just follow the book and go from 1 to 10 and take the material serious, I really feel like they're going to be able to play their asses off at the end. That's the way I feel, and other people have been really impressed too, and I hope that it has that kind of impact.
Well, we'll certainly make all of the books available on the text accompanying our video with links to that. And of course, Jim's website, jimsnidero.com, has everything there and available for one to look at and to order. So, hopefully this will give a little boost to that.
I appreciate it.
Final question. I sort of insinuated it, and I know some of the answers, but what do you do away from music? What are your hobbies? What are the things that you enjoy doing away from music?
Well, as you know, I love golf. I've only been playing golf though for about 5 years, but I take it very seriously. And we've discussed this before that there are some very close similarities to playing a sport like that and music. You know, athletes often talk about being in the zone. If you watch the Olympics and these gymnasts or something like that, there's no way they could perform on that level without being in an incredible zone at the moment and stuff. And that's the way that we try to play music too. And I love trying to just find that zone with the ball. And golf is one of the only sports where the ball's not moving.
Exactly. It's sort of like the reed before we blow up. You've got to
There
set
you
it in
go.
motion.
There you go. There you go. So I like that, and I feel like it's something that my wife plays golf too. So I feel like it's something that we'll hopefully be able to do for a long time to come as we get older. I'm an avid chef. I've been cooking for a long time. I come from a family of I'm Italian American, and my grandmother and my mother and everybody else were terrific chefs. I grew up on real good food, and it's something that I've taken serious as well. I used to go over there. There's 100 cookbooks, but I it's something that I really enjoy, and it's been that's probably my longest hobby is cooking. I've been serious about that for about 35 years.
Now, are you a
Yeah.
fan of the bear?
Fan of who?
The bear?
The bear.
Yeah, you know about that series?
No.
Oh my gosh, you are going to fall in love. This is going to change your life. It's one of the great series on TV. I'm not sure. It's on Hulu to stream there. Three
Oh,
seasons, three or
I
four
don't have
seasons.
Hulu. I
You're
guess
going
I,
to need to get it because it's about an Italian family. We're chefs and they open a restaurant. It's about cooking. And I know it sounds simplistic, but it's one of the best written and acted shows on TV. Jim, you're going to love this. Trust
all right.
me. You will not believe it.
The bear, Bear.
Yep, yep. The bear.
Okay.
When you started describing this to me, I was like, wow, this is a natural feat. I mean, you're not going to be able to turn it off. You're going to binge watch.
Oh, that's great, man. And I generally, as I've gotten older, I generally try to enjoy uh, nature more. I spend time just hanging out and gardening, doing things like that, and trying to connect a little more. I've lived in Manhattan for so long, and I have a chance now to do that kind of thing somewhere else, and uh, that's basically it. There's like you said, there's only so many uh, hours in the day, and
That's true.
between those things, I like cars. I have a nice car, and that's something I think about sometimes. But it's really golf and cooking are my two hobbies.
Okay, okay. Well, we have to get together and play over the next few months when I'm
Yeah.
back in shape to do so, and it'll be fun to hang out and do that and hang out a little bit after the interview. But thank you so much for doing this, and I hope all these stories and all of the serious way you approach music and have done so will rub off on some of our listeners because I think
Oh, that would
it's a
be
good I think
wonderful.
it's a good way to go. So
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Ed.
you bet. Thanks, Jim.